Adam Smasher is often portrayed as the endpoint of human evolution, a man who removed weakness and replaced it with something stronger, faster, and more efficient. In a world defined by augmentation, where survival often depends on our willingness to chrome up, Smasher appears to be the logical conclusion of that philosophy. But that interpretation only exists on the surface, because when you trace his story back to its origin, you see that he was never human to begin with. Smasher was not born extraordinary. He grew up in New York City, just another violent product of collapse-era America. Someone who built his identity on being the most brutal person on the block. Even before the Chrome and Arasaka, he was already defined by domination and a complete lack of empathy. Not long after joining a local combat gang, he rose to the ranks to become its leader during the collapse of the United States of America. And that rise says everything you need to know. Smasher was never shaped by power, he was always chasing it. A man that was driven by control and by the thrill of it. Even after the gang fell apart, he simply moved on to new systems that could feed the same hunger. The military and then later mercenary work. Different uniforms but the same pattern. Because the truth is simple, Smasher was never becoming a monster. He already was one. Cybernetics didn't create him, they just removed the last remaining friction between who he was and what he wanted to become. After taking up the life of a mercenary, specializing in brutal and destructive work, he would eventually take a contract from Arasaka in 2015 that would define his final form. Smasher and a team of mercenaries were sent to steal prototype technology from a rival, routine work for someone like him, but the operation collapsed into chaos. During the raid, 2 rocket-propelled grenades struck him, leaving him critically injured and barely intact. What remained of his body was carried away by his own crew in a backpack and rushed to a medical facility. In the law, it states that he was effectively dead for over 8 minutes before the doctors managed to restart his brain. For most people, this would be the point where the cost of this life becomes undeniable, where hesitation sets in and the question of, "What am I doing?" finally demands an answer. But for Smasher, that moment never comes, because somewhere in those 8 minutes of death, whatever remained of his humanity died with him. Arasaka, who already anticipated what his fate would be, had a deal prepared before he even woke up. A full-body conversion for a 15-year contract. In Smasher's own words, "They figured I just walked into some bad luck, and they liked my resume, performance record, skill, good looks and all that." The reality, however, was far more absolute. Lying in a life support tank, Smasher understood that refusing the offer did not mean returning to who he was. It meant being discarded entirely. He had never seriously considered a full-body conversion before, simply because it had never been accessible to him. Now, stripped down to almost nothing, with no attachment to the humanity he had already lost, he accepted the corpo's deal. Smasher's immediate acceptance doesn't really reflect a rejection of what he's losing, but the absence of anything left to lose. It's not that he willingly abandons his humanity, it's that there was nothing left in him keeping him anchored to it. By that point in his life, Smasher had already stripped away almost everything that could be called human. So when the offer comes, there's no internal conflict to resolve. Only survival and strength remain as functioning priorities. That detail is what separates him from every other character in the Cyberpunk universe. Because where others fight to preserve something, Smasher never had anything he wanted to keep in the first place. Once inside his new body, Smasher does not experience the fragmentation that defines so many others. In Cyberpunk 2077, cyberpsychosis is described as the moment where the mind can no longer reconcile the loss of humanity with the presence of overwhelming augmentation. It is, in a way, proof that something human still exists, something that resists the erasure of a person's sense of self and their emotional core. Through Regina Jones's questline, Psycho Killer, we are given a clearer understanding of what cyberpsychos actually look like. The individuals we encounter are not empty machines, but people overwhelmed by the tension between what they were and what they've become. Many of them display fragments of memory, emotion, and identity. However, even at their most dangerous, the fact that they can still be cured of cyberpsychosis, or at least function in a normal capacity, like the MaxSec agents and in particular Melissa Roy, means there is still something recognizably human beneath the surface, something that hasn't fully let go. Smasher never even reaches a point close to this, not because he is immune to psychological collapse, but because his mind has already accepted the loss of his humanity. In other words, there is nothing left to collapse. There is no internal resistance left fighting for him to remain human. The emotional core that would make any normal person break from a 96% cybernetic conversion no longer exists. This emptiness is what allows him to fully embrace a philosophy that appears throughout older cyberpunk lore, where Smasher openly argues that flesh is obsolete, and that metal is the natural future of humanity. However, when he embodies that belief, it reveals something deeply flawed about it. His body may be more efficient, more durable, and more powerful, but it is no longer an extension of the person, it is simply a replacement. Smasher is no longer just a human with cybernetic advancements. He is a machine that continues operating where a man used to be. When he converts, the distinction between tool and identity is fully erased. This idea is further reinforced through his relationship with Arasaka, where he exists merely as expensive property. Despite his overwhelming power, his role is ultimately defined by his utility, deployed to elite threats, enforce control, and carry out violence at a scale no human could sustain. As his role in Arasaka becomes solidified as a glorified hunting dog, I found that his existence carries a rather deep irony, because the very process that grants him his strength also strips away his autonomy. Smasher spends his life pursuing power, believing that by becoming the perfect weapon, he would be untouchable. Yet the same pursuit binds him completely to Arasaka, reducing him to a tool. This contradiction becomes even more striking when you consider that Smasher once acted outside authority. His discharge from the military for insubordination suggests he wasn't always willing to submit, that he valued acting on his own terms. But in chasing absolute power, he trades that autonomy away entirely, becoming the very thing he once resisted, something owned, directed, and ultimately controlled. When contrasted with characters like David Martinez or V, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. David, who pushes himself further because of his desperate desire to hold on to the people and emotions that define him, and V, depending on the path the player takes, constantly struggles with the idea of losing control and becoming something that is unrecognizable from himself. In both cases, their humanity is defined by resistance, by the very fact that there is something that they refuse to give up. And in the end, for David at least, that is what causes the cyberpsychosis to take root. His stress, mixed with desire and constant cybernetic upgrades, stack on top of each other until his mind can no longer fight against it. Adam Smasher, on the other hand, represents the complete absence of that struggle, because he has already made the decision to let everything go. His actions throughout the timeline only reinforce this idea. Whether it is indiscriminately slaughtering civilians during the Fourth Corporate War, hunting down targets with complete disregard for collateral damage, or executing David without hesitation in Cyberpunk Edgerunners, there is no trace of internal conflict. Even his rivalry with Morgan Blackhand, one of the last figures who represent a more human form of strength, highlights this divide. Blackhand refuses to engage with Smasher on his terms, because doing so would validate Smasher's worldview, that metal is better than meat. This is why Adam Smasher should be viewed as a warning against transhumanism, even if it promises transcendence to become something greater than a human. Is it worth it if you're losing your humanity in the process? What is the point of improving if you lose the very thing getting improved? While Smasher represents that idea taken to its absolute extreme, he still shows that a higher form of existence may not be the happy ending for humanity, but instead a hollow life living without emotions. Smasher exists without fear, without empathy, and without any meaningful connection to the world around him. And while that makes him efficient, it also makes him fundamentally empty. In a sense, he becomes something like a ghost, because the essence of his humanity and sense of identity disappeared long before his physical body ever could. Adam Smasher's story represents a tragic erosion of the human soul. It shows the gradual removal of everything that makes a person human, until nothing remains but function. His life from the streets of the Bronx to the heights of Arasaka Tower is defined by a single constant idea, that power is worth any cost. What his existence proves, however, is that there is a point where the cost becomes total, where nothing is left to justify what was gained. The final death of the human soul is a choice he makes, and in that choice he leaves behind everything that makes him human, becoming a cold and unfeeling instrument in a world that no longer sees people as anything more than tools.